Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest NBS webinar looking at navigating the Building Safety Act. I'm Richard Waterhouse. I'm going to be chairing the session today, and we've got a fabulous panel for you of experts who'll be able to answer lots of questions. Some of those questions will be live. You'll be able to ask us questions, so please do use the Q&A feature. There are lots of you on this webinar. This is the biggest webinar we've ever done. We have 3,589 registrations. So that could be a lot of questions, but you've already sent through over 500. So we've prepared some of those for the panel. We will be going through those. It's a 1-hour session, but for those who can stay later, we will be keeping this running maybe for an extra 20, 25 minutes to try and answer some of the questions that come through on the day. It is the biggest change the industry has seen in decades, lots and lots of legislation out there and lots of confusion, particularly around application to non-HRBs, high-risk buildings. What happens to non-traditional contracts? How do we manage information management on those high-risk projects and others? Well, let's find out from our panel. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Dieter.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dieter Bender-Gockman. I'm Director of Legal and Technical Services at EPR Architects and author of the RIBA's Health and Safety Guide and forthcoming Principal Designers Guide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dieter. Olga.
Hi, everybody. I'm Olga Katsanova, and I represent the view of manufacturers. So I work for Hilti, and I'm heading the technical marketing department.
Wonderful. Thank you, Olga. Adrian.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adrian Shilliday, and I'm a technical director for Galfa Tri, and I'm representing all of the contractors in how we navigate the Building Safety Act, and I look after our design management and BIM and information management procedures for the business.
Wonderful. So we've got a great spread of the industry, but also looking at this from a legal perspective as well. Ben.
Thanks, Richard. I'm Ben Smith. I'm a senior associate at Fenwick Elliott, who are a specialist construction law firm. And a large part of my practice now is related to Building Safety Act and related regulations, both disputes. I'm a disputes lawyer, but also supporting our colleagues with their front-end work, working for contractors and subcontractors.
Wonderful. And of course, this wouldn't be an NBS webinar without some support from NBS. So we've got Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hamill, Innovation Director here at NBS, and I was chair of the Specification subgroup as part of the Golden Thread initiative under BRAC.
Thank you for that. So we're going to start at the high level and just look a little bit about what is the new regime and how does that work. So Ben, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Could you just summarize the new regime, including the buildings that are in scope on high risk?
Yes, I mean, summarising the entirety of the new regime might be a little bit difficult, as I'm sure lots of the audience are already familiar with. This is a large and sprawling subject that only seems to get larger by the day. But by now, everybody, I think, will be familiar with the Building Safety Act itself, which brought in primarily a number of new claims and routes to claims for parties who were affected historically by building safety defects, so primarily leaseholders and other interested parties, including the Health and Safety Executive and local authorities, etc. What we've seen more recently in the last few months is a raft of new legislation, secondary legislation coming out by way of regulation. They all have, unfortunately, not very snappy titles, but they all do something slightly different. And we'll be dealing with, I think, quite a bit of those today. So I'm just going to very quickly run through those. So we've got the Building Regulations Amendment England regulations. These are the ones that amend the building regs and apply to all buildings, including HRBs, and they set out the new duty holder competency regimes, which we'll be dealing with in more detail today. Then you've got the Building Approved Inspectors regulations, and those amend the existing Building Approved Inspectors regs to support the new higher risk building controls that are being brought in, and provide that the Building Safety Regulator will now be the Building Control Authority for high risk buildings. So that's moved away from local authorities and approved inspectors. Then you've got I did tell you they weren't very snappy titles. They were the building higher risk building procedure regs. That sets out the new building control regime for high risk buildings. And that brings in a number of concepts which people may have read about or be familiar with already, which are the gateways and the mandatory requirements around change control, for example, the golden thread requirements and mandatory occurrence reporting. And then lastly, you've got the high risk buildings, management of safety risks regulations, and those deal with how your accountable person, principal accountable person, should be managing building safety risks for occupied buildings that they are managing. And separately, we've also had high risk building description regs, which clarified what is the description of a high risk building, which I'll come on to now. So buildings within scope, in terms of high risk buildings, in England, we're talking about buildings that are over 18 metres high or greater than 7 stories, have 2 or more residential units. And this is for design and construction. They include hospitals and care homes, but they exclude prisons and hotels. I should say that I think probably 9 months ago now, there was an information release from government that suggested that these will be clarified to include military premises, but that, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been formalised yet. And then in terms of the BSA defines an HRB by adopting that definition effectively, and sets out, and those the bits that then apply to high risk buildings, so the points we've just discussed. That's reflected in Part 3 of the Building Safety Act, so the golden thread, duty holders, gateways, etc. And then for buildings which are in occupation, so once you've done your design and construction, again, it's over 80 metres and plus 7 stories, 2 or more residential units. This time it excludes hospitals and care homes and excludes prisons and hotels. And the part of the BSA which deals with buildings, Part 4, again, that leads to the regs that I've just discussed. Now, I know we've had a series of questions. Richard, do you just want me to jump into?
No, don't worry. We'll work our way through this. So there are slight differences though in some of the other nations. So yes. Wales, for example, yeah,
absolutely right. So Wales haven't yet issued their regulations for approval of high-risk buildings, although they're expected to come into force either later this year or in 2025. I mean, there's 2 significant differences as well. One is that Wales will use a different definition, I understand, of HRBs. They've only got a requirement for 1 residential unit, so it's the same height requirement, but only 1 or more residential units. And separately, Wales will have a different building safety regulator, and it's expected to rely more on local authorities. So in some respects, it will be slightly more akin to what was in England previously. And then I'll just touch on the rest of the union, if I may, as it currently stands at least. So in Scotland, again, this is only part of the BSA applies to Scotland, and that's predominantly the new claims that relate to construction products and cladding requirements under the new sections 148, 149 in the BSA. They're new routes to claim there, and they adopt the same standard, which is unfit for habitation. So in a nutshell, it's where a party fails to comply with requirements related to a construction product or in relation to a cladding product. They make a misleading statement about that product, which results in it being used in a way it should not be used and or is inherently defective. And then it's used in the construction of a building and causes that building to be unfit for habitation. Again, people may be now familiar with that unfit for habitation test. But really, I mean, what leading case law tells us about unfit for habitation is if, for example, your building isn't compliant with the building regulations relevant to fire safety, that is an example of not being fit for habitation. They've also adopted the same or parts of the BSA that relate to extended limitation periods. So for construction products, you've got a 15-year prospective limitation period, and for cladding, 30 years.
And Scotland has a different way again.
Yes, and then
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And then Northern Ireland, so most of the BSA doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, but there are a few sections that do apply, and they are things like the Home Ombudsman schemes, various amendments to the Architects Act, construction and construction product regulations. So it's a bit of a mixed bag outside of England.
And in terms of its application, obviously there's lots about the high risk buildings, but what about the non-high risk buildings? Because this applies to all buildings, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. There are some substantial obligations now under these new regs which apply to all buildings. I think previously the focus was very much on HRBs, but now particularly the duty holder regime, which requires there to be, for example, principal designer and principal contractors who have particular skill sets and have to be able to demonstrate their competency to carry out those roles. Those will apply to all buildings going forward, and they're quite onerous obligations that parties need to be aware of and need to, consider when they're taking on new projects, how they're going to cost for them, whether they're covered by their relevant PI insurance, and those types of considerations are all very, very relevant.
I think the insurance one is one we'll come on to when we get to discussing the architects areas on this. But just some of the detailed questions we've had from our audience earlier around domestic. So one of those is, does a homeowner carrying out their own work on their house but use multiple subcontractors need to comply with the principal designer rules? Yeah,
I mean, I'll caveat this with I personally don't do a lot of kind of domestic work, but I did have a look into this because I think I, along with lots of other people, have been labouring under the assumption, wrongly, that why would government be legislating around what people can and can't do around their own domestic properties, particularly when we're talking about relatively low value works, potentially. But I think it's reasonably clear from the new regulations that if you are using, as in this example, a number of contractors who are all doing different aspects of the works, and I would have assumed including some design of the works, then there will need to be a principal designer, so someone who takes responsibility for the design of the works overall and has that coordinating responsibility. I mean, in your example, it may well be that the homeowner has an architect or has used an architect to prepare designs, and it might then be that, if they retain that architect for a project management type role or something like that, that they then can step in and take that on board. But yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, they will need to be cognizant of those obligations.
And a follow-up to that question was, how does it work if the domestic client only wants to engage the architect up to the building regulations submission and carry on the management of that project beyond that? I think there are some things that the principal designer has to do at that point if the client wants to take on that responsibility.
Yeah, precisely. And again, like I said, I'm not overly familiar with this, but generally speaking, the provisions of the building regs would still apply. And I think that is quite a difficult scenario, because I think it would only really kick in where your domestic client then wants to do everything themselves. So we're talking almost like a self-build type situation. And I suppose when I looked at that question, I kind of, at least in my experience, I struggled to see how applicable it would be generally. It seems to be quite a unique set of circumstances. What you're really talking about is domestic client doing the D&B themselves, and essentially doing most of the build themselves as well. So I just think that the kind of key point there.
Can I just pop across to Dieter, actually, because we're kind of now moving in towards the principal designer element. So we've got a project going. Have you got any further information on that one about what happens if that client wants to take over the role?
Yes, I think the important point to remember is that the new regime applies to all designers and all contractors that are carrying out work that's subject to building regulations. So if a domestic client decides to undertake design work, they become a designer. And if they decide to undertake some of the build work, they become a contractor. and therefore they would be subject to the duties of the designers or the contractors. And part of that will be a competence requirement. So I think a domestic client would need to determine, are they competent to undertake that design and construction prior to doing so? And that would be where I would encourage them to engage with the local building control authority or the registered building control inspector and registered building control approver that they might be using for their route to approval, to discuss that the same with them, to determine whether that's something they can undertake or whether they really ought to be looking to appoint competent designers and competent contractors to work on their behalf.
Can you tell us more about the competent? Oh, sorry, was that?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, that may also turn on, how many parties are involved. Because my understanding was that you get a principal, that you need a principal designer, for example, where there is more than one contractor, or that there might be more than one contractor. But the definition of contractor under the regs includes the client, but excludes domestic clients. So if you've got a domestic client who's going to do the work themselves, it seems to me, at least on that reading, that you wouldn't necessarily then need a principal designer. But perhaps, like all Building Safety Act points, the building regulation points, it's not entirely as clear as it maybe should be. But I agree with Dieter insofar as it would definitely be worth speaking to the regulator in those circumstances and getting clarity, just in case they have a different interpretation.
And I think that there's a key point here, isn't there? That there's going to have to be some pragmatism here at first until we get more of an understanding of how the regulator will see some of these issues. But Dieter, just following on the competencies, can you tell us more about the competencies around the client and the principal designer and principal contractor?
Absolutely, yeah. I think probably the first point to bear in mind is this new regime is all about procedure. It's not about technical requirements. So the technical requirements of complying with the building regulations haven't changed. Functional requirements are the same. The routes to compliance are the same. So from a technical perspective, you need to know what you needed to always know in terms of design and construction. What's changed is the procedural requirements to making sure that you meet those relevant requirements of the building regulations. So in terms of how you design, how you record what you've designed, and how you record your compliance, how you're demonstrating that you've met the relevant requirements of the building regulations, and then for contractors to do the same in terms of construction.
So that record keeping is going to be absolutely central to not just the design and construction process, but operation and management as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the idea through the whole regime, and Dame Judy Hackett made it very clear from her review, that we've got this disjointed design and construction handover process at the moment, and this is all about making sure everybody's communicating, collaborating, coordinating what they do, so there is that consistent thread of information going through the design, construction and handover. And I think we'll speak a bit more about the golden thread later on this morning. But just stepping back to the competence point, I think there's two layers that people need to be aware of. There's the organizational capability, which is making sure that your practices, your design companies, your contracting companies have the processes, the systems, the policies and procedures in place to make sure the checks and balances are there, that everybody that's being asked to do work is competent to do it. And you have a review process to make sure you're assessing that's effective and constantly being improved. Something like a quality risk management system is a perfect example, something like that. And I am aware that the Building Safety Alliance is working with the British Standards Institute to draft a new standard that's very much based on ISO 9001, that will be a standard for demonstrating organizational capability.
And it's been a constant series of questions coming through prior to the event and now asking, where do we find out more information about that? How do we know that a client is competent? How does the client, the employer, know that the architect and the principal contractor are competent?
Well, I think one of the overarching principles of the new regime is that everyone needs to take responsibility for what they do. So I would suggest that organizations need to take responsibility now for making sure they do have the policies, procedures and process systems in place and can demonstrate that to their clients. And as part of that, they are then looking at the individuals that work for them, whether it be that designers or contractors, to ensure that those individuals are competent. And in that respect, it's having the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors to undertake the work that they're required to do to make sure that what they do is in compliance with the building regs, be that the design to make sure it complies, or whether it's the construction to make sure the built work complies. And again, everybody needs to take responsibility for ensuring that they have those skills. And one of the key behavioral aspects of that is acknowledging when you have a limitation and when you don't know how to do something, and asking for assistance or asking for better supervision, or saying, no, I can't do that, somebody else needs to assist. Or equally, if you're seeing somebody else that's doing something that's beyond their competence, to flag that and say, hang on, people, we need to stop and take a moment and get this right, rather than turning a blind eye or being complicit to something that you know may not then comply with the building regs at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Sorry, Richard, can I just add one
Yeah,
more
yeah.
thing there? What Dieter says about parties taking responsibilities is really important, because what I think is one of the key messages behind the Building Safety Act and all these additional regulations that we've seen doesn't get expressly stated necessarily, is that there's a real, the real purpose of a lot of this legislation obviously is to keep people safe in and around buildings, but it pushes responsibility back away from the inspection regime we had previously, back onto individual parties, and those parties who the government feels are best placed to ensure that they comply with, for example, the building regulations. And we see that not just through the regs, but also through, you know, the signing of the compliance certificates, for example, the demonstrating of your own competency. So I just think that's something really important to bear in mind, is that that's the way the industry is now being pushed, and also parties working together and not being siloed. And from a legal perspective, what we would see in the past is, let's say a client trying to hive off lots of risk down onto the main contractor and then similarly down to the supply chain. I think what people need to be aware of is that won't necessarily work now within this new regulatory regime, because it is contrary to the way the regime is set up and contrary to the behaviours that it's trying to drive.
And if I just come in just to ask Dieter a question there, Richard, is there, I know you're involved with the RIPA, Dieter, but is there anywhere which says, for the role of principal designer, these are the services I'll provide at each stage? Is a sort of simple checklist, is something you can involve in your contracts and things?
Yeah, so we've got the BSI Flex, which has been published, which is an overarching framework for competence for all parties. That, I understand, is soon to become an actual British standard, BS 8670. Under that, we've then got the PASs 8671 and 8672, which sets out the competence for principal designers and principal contractors. And then I'm aware that there's a number of institutes, the RIBA included, that are then producing their own professional services contracts to then take some of those framework duties, look at them in the context of the regulations, and then to produce professional services contracts, which then have their set of duties and services within them that people can then use and refer to.
Thank you for that. I just want to come back to the content around managing and recording information, because there is a requirement for the change control log as part of the process of design and construction. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and then what happens on non-HRBs in terms of managing those changes?
Are you coming to me? I'm not going to.
Yes, sorry, Dieter. Yes,
okay.
yes.
So I think, yes, it's important to bear in mind that, again, to repeat the point, that the new regime applies to all projects, whether it's an HRB project or not. And so the requirement to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations is there for everybody that's working on a project in England that's subject to building regs. So I think if you're designing a project, whether it's an HRB or not, you need to have the processes in place to make sure you can demonstrate that the design complies. And then you have a process in place to then manage any change control to that, to ensure that once you've got approval for your design, you are then managing those changes to make sure the changes don't then undermine that compliance, so that what is built does comply with the building regulations. Now, for higher risk buildings, that process has been prescribed in law. So we do have the prescribed process for control changes, and we have a hierarchy of changes, which are the recordable change, which is any change which includes changes to your processes and procedures for compliance. You have notifiable changes, which you need to let the regulator know about, but allows you to proceed with work. And then you have a major change, which requires approval before that work can proceed. So there's what's known as a hard stop to that change. So if you've got a high risk building and you've got your gateway to your building regulations approval, but then for some reason following that approval, you need to make a change to that approved design. If it falls within the definition of a major change, then you need to refer that back to the regulator. The regulator then has 6 weeks to review that change and to let you know whether yes, that's accepted and you can proceed with it, or no, they're not convinced you've submitted enough information or justified how that change complies and you might need to do more work. So there is an impact on the potential program there that you need to be aware of. The more change that's involved following approval, the more likely there will be delays to your construction program.
And another principle within the regime is the concept of collaboration of the client and the principal designer and the principal contractor working together to ensure that the design and construction is and demonstrably meets the requirements of the regulations, but also is recorded and handed over. So that's coming over to you, Adrian. That starts to bring in another level, doesn't it? Because there are always changes in a project.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we've had a number of questions on the chat and previously around what does it mean for design and build? How do you manage all of those changes? Are there going to be a different approach from our clients? And I think the whole of the Building Safety Act and the associated procedures, what they're doing is really just driving a bit more rigorousness to the whole process. There's a lot more recording of all the changes, as Peter has covered. And I think from our perspective as a contractor, how do we sit and manage all of those things in line with each of the different types of contracts and actually bringing all the right people together and collaborating? And it's interesting when we were chatting before that Dale Sinclair had written the Assembling the Collaborative Team. Those things all become a lot more important when you're bringing the lead designer together, the contractor, considering the procurement routes. And I think we've seen a number of questions around, will that change? I don't think it will. I think clients will get better at specifying what they need. They'll get better at understanding what their designers need to do. Contractors then also have a responsibility to almost be the group in the middle who's checking that what was done before complies with the Act, what happens during construction, and we'll have procedures, construction control plans, change control plans. We'll have much better approach for quality, working alongside our subcontractors or manufacturers. And we as a business are very, very definitely seeing a big lift in the quality of what we're getting from our designers, the quality of what we're getting from our supply chain, because everyone is reacting in it. And I think that's what Dame Judith was expecting to see, that there's a recalibration of industry. It's not a change, as I think Dieter has said, and you've said, Richard, we're doing exactly as we were doing before. We're just recalibrating, getting everyone back onto a level playing field again. And hopefully that applies into all types of projects, and if particularly into high rise, where you just add that extra level of rigorousness around what we actually need to do, and it reduces the risk for everyone.
So there's been lots of questions, lots of discussion.
There has been lots of questions.
Hal Davis at CCPI talking about the future of design and build. The regulation says that the design should be complete at Gateway 2. So
yes,
come on, from your point of view, how
so
does this
it's
work, design and build?
interesting. Yeah, so I was thinking about this yesterday, and I've been drafting some slides internally because we do a lot of work. I present on our building safety modules every couple of months. I present on quality and compliance. And one of the things we're looking at is a more robust approach to procurement from our clients. We're definitely seeing a little bit of a change where, and Steve and I have discussed around performance specifications, potentially old money 4A. How do we deal with that from our designers? Then as part of the contract line, which may move depending on your procurement route and early contractor engagement, the contractor then bringing their specialists on board and having a sufficient time to do that work so that you actually submit a much more robust gateway 2 that enables you to reduce the risk to everyone. Now, you mentioned earlier around Scotland, so I'm based in Scotland, and we've had that approach for building warrant and around the technical standards for as long as I can possibly remember. You cannot start on site unless you've had an approved technical submission. And the principles of what we're now doing in England and Wales and obviously Northern Ireland are going to be very, very similar. And design and build didn't change in Scotland with that. So I don't think it will change in England and Wales and Northern Ireland either. I think what it will drive is a much more move to the left of the design and having all the right people on board in a much more collaborative environment. And actually, in many cases, back to doing some of the basics in a much more rigorous way. And the lead designer being a lot more forefront. And I think there was lots of questions around the design manager and again around contracts. We are being asked to be both the principal designer and principal contractor under both CDM and the Building Safety Act. And all we're there doing is we're accountable for doing that. But then we make sure through our own processes and procedures that we then nominate the right responsible people who've also got the competency to deliver. And in many cases, I think, again, there was a number of questions around true design and build. Over the last 20 years, I don't actually remember a project where we haven't brought a novated designer, a novated lead designer, or we've put a proper professional team together. So there's always going to be that professional oversight of the design and working with our supply chain, the lead designer, bringing that all together and then working together as we build out on site. And that's been one of my tasks. I also look after digital quality tools that we then get to the end of the project, and we've done all the due diligence. It's been designed correctly, interfaces designed a little bit more robust, and then we actually deliver what we should have been doing for a long time.
So Galliford Try got this sorted. You know how you're approaching this.
Well,
don't worry.
So, yeah, so it's go ahead, Richard.
But what about, is this true of all of the main contractors? What about the regional contractors?
So we're all starting to get our heads around it. So ourselves at Galliford Try and a number of others, we've been through for that sort of tier 1 level. A lot of us are starting to go through the Building Safer Future Charter. So we were one of the first companies who did that. We assessed our full procedures, and all of the others are starting to do the same thing. When you then get into regional contractors, where you're stepping down on the scale of project, they need to look at their competency in the scale of what they're actually going to deliver. What we've also picked up, and again, looking at some of the work we're doing internally, there is also a lot of work from the CIOB and APM, etc., looking at all the other wider competencies. You know, we've been talking a lot about principal designer, but we've now also got supervisor competencies around, do you understand quality procedures from 9001 or quality procedures 8000 around what we build out on site? So there's a lot more focus on that quality of delivery side as well. And our manufacturers, I know Olga will come on to that, they have definitely upped their game in terms of that support in their products and how you install them and what they should look like, and the ccpi. It's definitely, we're just chipping away at gradually getting everything better.
So a few kind of more detailed questions then, little scenarios in there. If the specification is a performance spec, because lots of people will have just a performance spec, sometimes there'll be a mix within the specification. what is the impact then on the specialist subcontractor who has to either provide a solution to that performance spec or even put an element of design in?
Yes.
How are they treated?
So absolutely, I think all we're doing is no different to what we've been doing before, and that's old 4A, 4B, depending on where your contract line comes in. And Steve and I have chatted about this in the past and how NBS Chorus allows you to write that performance specification, and then through that whole change control process, ISO 19650 processes in terms of that approvals, that the lead designer is still always there and the other designers are always still there. We've got robust design responsibilities matrix, and we make sure that it's really, really clear where one level of design ends, where the next one comes in, and they overlap and they're coordinated into the overall design. It's actually one of my tasks at the moment, working across the business, being a lot more robust around our responsibilities matrix, our information release schedules with our whole supply chain, and making sure if we're able to through ECI, and again, some of our clients are allowing us to do that a lot earlier, that takes a lot of the risk away. It makes it a lot easier for the designers to actually have, this is the products that we're going to use, this is our supply chain. We bring our lessons learned to say, actually, those products don't work together anymore because of the new testing regime that comes on board. So we're definitely seeing that performance design into subcontractor design, and we're just now starting to be a lot more rigorous in how we describe that and to bring it all together. So I don't think there's a lot of change.
If I can jump in there, Adrian, just a specific example. If you're employing a designer to do a sprinkler system or a cladding system, but it's performance spec, specialist,
yes.
Will you ask the specialist subcontractors to provide a prescriptive solution before the gateway to submission?
Yes, I think that was probably the right route to go. And what we would hope, and again, the clients and their advisors, allowing enough time in the contract that we can move from that 4A prescriptive specification, that there is enough time to develop that specification before you submit for gateway 2 and you go out on site. I know we have talked about this around cladding particularly. There will be a performance specification. They'll say it looks like this. This is the overall performance, and we've talked about the new Chorus early tool that says this is what we need to achieve, and these are the regulations and standards that we need to achieve. And then the subcontractor's prescriptive specification says this product complies with this requirement from each of the designers, and there is a process of approvals. I think some of the questions we would use, common data environments, we'd have workflow procedures, etc. And again, it's just that adding that a little bit of rigorousness, and everybody knows exactly who's doing what. And we're breaking down, particularly around fire safety, we're being really, really clear who is responsible for each exact element, rather than, I think in the past, there's just this wholesale, you're dealing with fire, where in reality it's broken up into little chunks across the whole team, and the supply chain are just another part of that. But if you've set up your collaboration correctly, then it should all work together.
Peter.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question? Adrian, in practice, when you're adopting this approach, are you finding that, in a standard D&B, that the client and their, presume their designer then gets novated over to you, are they on board with that approach, or are you still getting pushback?
I think it depends on how early you're able to get on board. No, we do novate our design team over in most cases. There is the odd instance where we are brought on maybe from stage 2. We've got the odd instance that we're on board from the very outset. We bring a whole team together. That would include the lead designer, who would obviously be principal designer in this scenario. But if they're novated, they would carry on that role, and we would work as closely as we possibly can with them and the supply chain to bring that together. In many cases, we're just feeding in to say that product that was a performance spec, yes, it works. Sometimes we have to say, actually, it doesn't technically work in the scenario that the client's expecting. And I think everyone's in the same sort of scenario. We're just starting to get into that little bit more detail, and we're seeing the same sort of common themes around key cladding, roofing, fire stopping, etc. Those are probably the key ones that we're all now a little bit more focused on. And we are starting to definitely see a definite step change in the quality and approach that we're now seeing from our consultants.
And sorry, just one more.
No, sorry, but I just need to bring detail.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that the client's primary duty under the new regime is to ensure there's sufficient time and resources for all the duty holders to comply with their duties. So it's incumbent on all designers. They shouldn't start any work until they know that the client understands their duties. So I think it's incumbent on all designers, particularly those undertaking principal designer services, to have these conversations with their clients to say, we do need more time. We do need to look at procurement slightly differently. We do need the contracting bodies to be brought on earlier because they are designers as well. If we are going to plan, manage and monitor the design, we need all the designers in the room. So we need all those specialist contractors. We need all those specialist suppliers. We need them around the table to make sure that what we're designing at stage 3 is right and is going to work at stage 4 and can be built. So that is that communication and liaison piece, which is so important.
So let's move on then, because you mentioned the specialists in there, and some of those specialists are our manufacturers as well. That community is essential to actually getting these schemes to work and be right. So, Olga, I know in our previous conversations, you said that the manufacturing community has really stepped up and made a difference in this area.
Yes, thanks, Richard. So, yes, I think for manufacturers, the key difference that we have noticed is, whereas previously we would have been involved quite late in the process, and I think now in the recent years, we are brought in quite early on, and also quite often we are actually then part of the collaborative team, and even in instances, often even supporting the design team with the design and specification. So that piece is a lot more frequent now. And for many years, I have been the big advocate on designing earlier on, making those critical decisions, in particular fire safety, earlier in the process. And we're definitely seeing the change. In the past, if we would have just worked only with a specialist installer and contractor, now we also work very closely with the architects and the designers much earlier on. And also we had to change how we organize ourselves, right? We employ field-based team members and even specification engineers that can actually be there and involved and, you know, sitting at the table. There's also other trends, so not just you know, the Grenfell and the Building Safety Act that are impacting us, but even trend towards digitalization. So again, BIM services offering is something that we are now bringing in, being able to design and model our solutions quite early on, and that could then feed into the golden thread process, and again having all of that ready earlier on. And then the other element, again with digitalization, there is a lot bigger pull for software solutions. So again, you know, how do you prove that what you design is what you install? So again, as Hilti, we recently actually brought into a software company into our group called Fieldwire. So again, I just want to highlight that there is bigger pull for manufacturers to deliver not just excellent hardware, but also software solutions and a service offering to be able to design upfront and also to record what we're doing, and to provide tools like selectors, or making sure that our data is right, whether it's on our website, through our documentation, whether it's through the platforms like MBS. So that's been a big change for us. And then the other piece is competency. We discussed that quite a lot early on for the designers and the contractors, but also as manufacturers, we play a role and we get a lot of pull to deliver CPD seminars and the trainings, whether it's to designers or the contractors. So we are playing a role on educating the industry, but also ourselves, actually, you know, how do we prove our own competence? And again, we've done a review similar to what Dieter mentioned earlier on, to say that there needs to be organizational responsibility and self-responsibility. So again, as manufacturers, we're actually also reviewing who are the different functions that we have within our organizations and who do they engage with, and especially the team members that provide design and specification support in the early stages or even later on. We make sure that they are also competent on one side, but also, do we have we done a competency matrix? Are their CVs up to date? What about the CPD? So the similar principles that apply to the designers and contractors also now apply to manufacturers, and we make sure that we then follow similar procedures.
And is it right, great, Richard? I think is the national regulator for construction products going to happen at some stage under the Office for Product Safety Standards? And I think that they've got a recall website that's been live for about 18 months with 2 or 3 examples of product recalls. And I think there was the big sort of Morel Day recommendations, which touched on the principles in the Code for Construction Product Information. I think that was a project you were actually involved with way back as well. But there's like just 11 really good principles in there on currency of information, guidance on application, installation manuals, third-party certification, technical language that's unambiguous. And I think that's a great starting point for manufacturers but that should have already been looking at it. But there's good stuff out there, but I think there's more to come on the manufacturer side.
Yeah, the CCPI, great guidance as well for manufacturers on how to describe the product. So you remove the rather over-the-top phrases that we use to try and promote products. So we get a much more technical resilience. And it's great to hear from Olga about how manufacturers are doing that. It's disappointing that the new regulator for products isn't up and running yet. And OPSS have been a little bit slow on that one, but that has to come, and there will be more information on which products will be regulated to a higher level. Of course, Paul Morel in his report said that all products should be regulated to that level. I think that's maybe too much of a step for the industry at first, but it has to come. And as part of the CCPI, there's also all the digital identifiers and having unique references for those as well. It kind of leads us then into the last stage of this, which is looking at information management and looking in more detail at change control. I mean, Dita, you've already mentioned change control on the larger projects. How does this work, though, for the smaller projects? Because my understanding of smaller projects is that if things go horribly wrong in smaller projects, it could still be local authority building control that look at that. But if there's one of the questions is what happens if there's a death in a domestic project? Well, that's where the regulator can still come in. Is that the case?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, whilst the regime isn't prescribed for projects other than higher risk buildings, the principles still apply. So the designer is still responsible for compliance with the design, the contractor is still responsible for compliance with the built work. So if there's any non-compliance, and I think with this, again, worth reiterating, this is all aspects of the building regulations, A through to S. So this isn't just about fire and structural safety. This is also about overheating. This is about ventilation. This is making sure the buildings we build aren't damp, there isn't mold, and all the health risks that are associated with those. If there is a failure in that respect, then it is still the contractor and the designers that could be found responsible for that if their design or construction hasn't complied with the relevant requirements of the building regulations. So it comes back to this point about responsibility. Just because the regime isn't as robust for buildings that aren't high risk buildings, the outcome is just the same, and it's just as important that designers and contractors take responsibility for the work they do to make sure that it's compliant.
And effective record keeping right the way through
Absolutely.
the process.
Yes,
So
very much
the
so.
golden thread, we've all heard of the golden thread and how it applies to HRBs. So is there anything we want to say about the golden thread and the change control processes? Stephen, where does MBS fit in all of this?
Well, maybe wider than MBS, but I think the first thing to say is under the new duties, I think the wording is ensure systems are in place across the whole team for the principal designer. So when you think of systems, it's like what standards you're going to follow. And I think it talks about electronic form. So if you're just a designer, I think you want to be making sure that your drawings and specifications show that you comply with the sort of building regs, and then you have something in place to show where things have been revised and where substitutions have been sort of notifiably approved. If you take a step above that and you look at the principal designer role, you're looking across all those designers, and the phrase is plan, manage, and monitor. So as an architect taking the role of principal designer, you're not taking responsibility for the structural engineering or the building services, but you are ensuring that the systems are in place across the whole team. And that under that role, as long as you take that principal designer role, that you're planning, managing, and monitoring. And if it hits the stage where you're not novated and that role's taken by the main contractor, design management, you've got to notify the client. I think there's going to be tempers, letters, and Dieter's books, and you've got to do that due diligence to make sure that those systems continue, and it doesn't just hit a sort of chasm and falls off, and then there's unscrupulous substitutions, no documentation, etc., etc. So it's not just specification; it's the whole set of documentation. But you've got to make sure you do it properly on all jobs.
Yeah, and also a key duty of principal designers and principal contractors is the duty to liaise with each other. So of course, that's going to be fundamental for any change control during the construction phase. You know, if a change is necessary, the principal contractor should flag it to the principal designer, so the principal designer can go back to the original designer to say, well, here's the proposal. Does this conflict with the original design intent? Does this pose a risk to the compliance? And if not, then okay, let's record that and let's document that, so the building owner at the end of the day knows that they've got a compliant building and they've got a record that shows that, and they can pass that information on to whoever requires it.
And all jobs, just quickly, Adrian, sorry, all jobs subject to building regulations, you need to keep those records, because you don't know what's going to happen 4 or 5 years later. But on the higher risk projects, that's where the recordable, notifiable major change process kicks in. But over to you, Adrian.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Dieter has said around that recording, and what we're picking up certainly within high risk projects, but the same principles apply, is how rigorous the team have looked at this at the planning gateway 1 and the outline out building safety case, and how that's tracked and recorded all the way through, that it feeds into the fire and emergency file that you have to do as part of your submission, your compliance statements. And one of the things we're now trying to encourage our design teams to complete is a REBA zone fire safety checklist, or there's the other from the LABC Part B procedural checklist. And it just puts a little bit of rigorousness and says, this is the line in the sand of what we expect it to do at Gateway 1 and Gateway 2. And that is your reference point, and your design can then be tracked against that. So again, you're moving a lot more to the left in determining how your design is going to comply, and that route to compliance, whether it's Part B, Section 2 in Scotland, or you've got fire engineering, or you've got alternative routes, is making sure that it's very well recorded. Everybody understands their roles and responsibilities, and that just feeds directly into the concept of golden thread in 19650, your common data environment, and then handing over into old money health and safety file, CIBSI, BISRIA standards that have been there as long as I can remember or care to remember. I think we're just trying to get back into some of those basics again and just try to be a lot more rigorous.
And it's worth noting, everybody, that tomorrow you will receive a follow-up email from MBS, and in there, there'll be lots of links to sources of information, sources of guidance for you. So we've mentioned quite a few. Do look out for that email tomorrow, because I think that's going to be a fantastic starting point for learning more and finding some really useful tools to help you manage. So coming back to Stephen and Dieter, I want to talk about a fictional 4-story building. So when it's not high risk, but it's actually still quite substantial. And how do we go about a pragmatic approach to recording the changes? Because that's what everybody really wants to know. What do I do to record this? One of the comments, one of the questions in the list is, can we just do this via email because we emailed the discussion and came up with an agreement for a change? Is that okay?
I think ultimately it needs to be proportionate. So every project potentially will be different, But I think this comes back to the discussion about competence and saying, right, what are you anticipating doing for the types of projects that you work on? What are the systems that you need to record this information, and making sure those systems work and that you regularly review that they are working. So I suppose, yes, in theory, just having change control recorded via email might be sufficient. I think it would depend on what the changes are, how many people are involved in the change discussion, and how technically complex those changes are, and what the change is, and what particular aspect of the building regulations it impacts upon. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think, again, it's about self-responsibility, thinking carefully, is this the best thing that I can be doing to ensure compliance and to communicate information about the same? It's interesting, one of Dame Judith's comments when she was doing her review is saying her view is all the systems and technologies and processes and software exist within the industry already. We don't need anything new. We just need to be using the systems we've got better.
Yes, absolutely.
And Stephen, in terms of what that means for change in specification, NBS is well, we've been pushing for years and making sure people do the right thing. We've got systems in place in NBS to be able to record those changes, haven't we?
Yeah, so when you're publishing the specification, I'd strongly recommend you don't reinvent the wheel and you follow things like the naming convention in the ISO 9650 standards, etc. Because then all the project team can agree on a standard that works. And then where we go maybe a little bit further inside NBS is within that PDF that gets published, you can record what's been revised. It's unfair just republishing a 800-page specification and expecting the contractor team to spot the changes. So having a clear way to sort of highlight, these are the clauses, these are the products, these are the requirements that have been revised. And what we did last year was improve that further, so it's down to the level of the clause item. So if just the class has changed, or just the standard has changed, that can be highlighted. And where we'd like to go further this year is introduce user-defined flags. So structural critical or fire critical items can be tagged for reporting and for highlighting as well. So it's an issue that we're taking very, very seriously here at NBS.
Thank you for that. We are getting toward the end of this first hour, I'm afraid. I know that many of you may need to leave after an hour. Just to reiterate, we will keep going for a while because there's so many questions we still haven't got to, and we do want to try and get to some of those questions. But I think it's worth summarising what we've seen so far, that Dame Judith wanted a cultural change in the industry in her initial report post-Grenfell. The government responded and said, we'll take all of your recommendations. And it's taken time, but we are getting that change in procedures. And it is about procedures. I look at this and think this is about doing the job properly, doing what we're all supposed to do at the right time with the right people. It's, as they say, it's not rocket science. I think there will be some cultural changes. Really interesting to hear from Ben about the client's strategy of always trying to push risk down into the industry. It's something I know the industry hates. We haven't yet got onto insurance and talking about how do the insurers view all this. That's got to come in the next few minutes. But then that record information and making sure we actually get change control and knowing that this isn't just about those large projects, it's about all projects, including those domestic projects or that 4-story building that is still substantial but doesn't fit within the scope of the increased regulation. It was also great to hear about some of the tools that are in place. For me, hearing design responsibility matrix is just manna from heaven. That's fantastic, because if you can be clear at the offset with your project, if you're competent to start the project and you say who's going to do what and when, that's going to make life an awful lot easier. You know, coming back to collaboration and working together, that presumption, the requirement that the client, the principal designer, principal contractor will collaborate and coordinate, will liaise, it leads to a better outcome for everybody. Now, obviously, we haven't talked about the start of the contract, the project, or the operation. That's slightly out of scope of this discussion, but clearly there's another area to cover in terms of that. But for those who are leaving, don't forget that you can come on to the nbs.com. There's huge amounts of information for you to be able to see. We will be sending you this email as well, and that will have all the information, all the links and the guidance that's available. So just for those who are leaving, I'd just like to say thank you to our panel on your behalf. So thank you for all of your contributions. So those who are leaving, thank you and goodbye. For those who can stay, we will stay on for a little while longer and try and just pull in a little bit more depth on some of the things we haven't covered just yet. So I would like to talk a little bit more about risk and about insurance. It's something that Ben mentioned in terms of the client and their approach and what they try to do. But there's risk then for all of the other parties. There's risk for the designers, there's risk for the manufacturers if their products aren't incorporated the way they're supposed to be, and for the contractors and their subcontractor base. So Dieter, can I start with you? There's been lots of talk about insurance companies not covering the architects in their role as principal designer. Is that something you're seeing?
I have heard sort of hearsay of that. I don't know firsthand. Certainly the insurers that I work with seem to be taking the view that actually what we're being asked to do as designers is no different to what they expected us to be doing anyway. You know, insurers expecting us to design in accordance with the building regs. Why wouldn't they? But actually what insurers are saying is, now that we've got the reasonable steps qualification in the legislation, so we don't have absolute duties in all respects, they're reasonably comfortable. If anything, they see this as a good opportunity to say, well, actually as designers and principal designers, you need to have more robust processes in place. You need to be doing things better and evidencing the same. And that's music to an insurer's ears. Because if there's a claim, there's the evidence that supports that to either defend it or to say, no, actually, yes, there was negligence involved. So it provides insurance with far more certainty, which obviously reduces their risk.
Yeah.
And also, I think moving forward, we're in a period of change at the moment, but hopefully 2-3 years down the line, when we've all been through the process a couple of times, things will settle down, things will become more certain. We'll all know how to work more collaboratively. This should end up with better buildings. So that in theory should end up with fewer claims, better risk management, and therefore less payouts for the insurers. So I would have thought this would be, you know, a great thing for them. So I'm surprised if people are finding that professional indemnity insurers aren't covering the designer or principal designer role.
Yeah, and Olga, for manufacturers, obviously, in some instances they'll be taking on more design responsibility because the whole point is bring forward the design towards Gateway 2. Are manufacturers ready for the responsibility of that design? There's a risk, isn't there, that they may not have the competence, or do you think those competencies are in place?
I think here I will answer as not representing all manufacturers, but as Hilti. As I mentioned before, we see a clear trend to be involved earlier and also being involved quite heavily in the design and specification. So not just guidance, you know, go to that document or that document, where we are actually acting effectively as part of the design team or as designers on certain instances. So for example, our bin service offering is a great example. And there we are part of the design team. And then, yes, there is, you know, service description in place. It's very clear what responsibility Hilti takes. And there is a discussion around legal responsibility that we would also take for the design that we produce. Now, not in all instances are we involved at that level, but yes, so we are getting involved, and there are certain contracts and responsibility that we would then take for the design that we produce. Are all manufacturers ready to act in that capacity? I think that will vary hugely, but there is definitely a significant pull. And again, there's a lot of discussion around collaboration and there is a big trend of bringing manufacturers involvement much earlier upstream. And then again, then you need to organize yourselves quite differently compared to just having, you know, somebody in technical support answering a question of a contractor. Here you need a design team of your own that you would then need to employ and make sure they're competent, and also have all the competency requirements met, again, that similar to anybody else who would act in the design capacity.
And that must be the same as well, Adrian. I was just going to say, that fits in perfectly, doesn't it, with your role with multiple subcontractors as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe just to add to what Olga said and Dieter has said earlier around that competency piece, and what we're actually finding is, yes, the CCPI is coming on board, a Construction Products Association, etc. But what we're actually picking up, it's not actually the clarity of how the information is presented. It's what does the information actually mean in the first place? And what we're finding is a big, big gap in understanding around some of the terminology that's used around fire testing and performance standards within the documentation. So the one I've literally picked up over the last couple of weeks, so BSEN 13501-1 is a classification of the performance of the product. So the A1, the A2, the Bs, you got the S notation, the D notation. How many people in industry actually know what those mean, and how do tools like NBS then help that transfer to say this product complies with the regulations in this way? And the whole confusion around, is it non-combustible, is it limited combustibility, is it class 0, is it class 1? There's a whole mishmash of terminology that everyone's sort of getting their heads mixed up around. And how does the NBS and REBA clarify some of those, not basics, but there are things that we see on a regular basis, and then the manufacturers being a little bit clearer as to what it means, designers going, actually, this needs to be non-combustible, that means this is the product that I need to look out for. And again, we're definitely seeing that lifting up. And then from us as a contractor, understanding those principles, and in our supply chain going, actually, my product needs to comply with that standard, otherwise it won't be specified in the first place. And we are very, very definitely seeing all the manufacturers are starting to develop new products that are non-combustible, that have the same performance requirements as they did previously, but then the net zero carbon, that's introducing new changes as well. And how do we bring all of those things together? So I would say over 2024, there's going to be a lot of recalibration, a lot of just refocusing, understanding the products back to basics, knowing how they fit together. How do they then integrate into the wider project going forward?
Yeah, so I'll maybe say a little bit about what we do there, because a lot of maybe people on the call receive specification as a PDF as opposed to see the entire MBS system. And what our technical authors do on the architecture side, the structural building services, is they'll research the standards that apply to each product. So whether it's from a detection alarm to an insulation board to slip resistant on a paving slab, you'll have the link to the relevant standard or standards, which jumps across to the Accurus CIS product. And then the technical authors have extracted the technical characteristics defined in that standard. So yeah, like surface spread of flame or slip resistance or a category of a smoke alarm or what have you. And there is drop down values in the generic template specification. The next thing we do is work with our manufacturer partners to align their technical content to that generic template. And what that allows you to do is quickly filter to find the product that meets your specific need for that product. But also it allows you through the construction phase to assess any proposed substitutions. Because if the information's aligned, you can more quickly say, no, that product doesn't meet the specification, because you've got them in a nice sort of data grid.
Oh, we've just entered the world of product substitution. And it's an area, I know NBS did work a few years ago and found that 30% of product substitutions were done without the knowledge or approval of the architect. Is it the end of product substitutions?
Depends.
Olga's got a hand raised. Maybe Olga from the manufacturer.
You muted that, Olga. There you go.
Sorry. Yes, I mean, from my side, and I think it was outlined quite well, right? That actually the change process is there, but depending on the type of building, that might, have an impact on the program, so that we might see less product substitution. But also, what we are actually noticing, whereas in the past, product manufacturers potentially were not consulted at the early stage, or the products were not selected early on, there's a clear trend, and we are seeing that evidently. If we're, manufacturers are being asked to engage early on, and also there is then discussion to understand, what is the applications, what are the systems, how the products will be put together, and that discussion happens much earlier on in the process. And then if you have the mantra, get it right the first time, quite often that actually means that the specification, if it is robust, I anticipate that we will see less product substitution. Obviously, I represent manufacturers, so I'm happy also to hear from the others, but there is a clear trend to actually select the products much earlier on and understand the requirements actually of what are the applications, what are the tests and the standards that need to be met. I think Adrian highlighted that quite well, that maybe previously there wasn't an understanding. Again, we are getting, as a manufacturer, more sophisticated questions from the designers, the architects, and we welcome that. Whereas in the past, typically Hilti would be contacted when something has gone already wrong on the job site, the wrong product was selected, and then you're starting to reverse engineer, but there's a lot of waste that has already happened. And then the worst case scenario obviously is that issue was not picked up, and the new regime avoids that by bringing those critical decisions much earlier in the construction stage. And I'm a big advocate for this. And again, it means that manufacturers need to organize themselves differently, need to be more competent, and need to support the industry much earlier in the construction process.
Adrian?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So if I put my contractor's quality hat back on, we look at inspection and test plans out on site, and as part of that, there would be material approvals processes, making sure that the product complies with the installation requirements, the performance requirements, and that ties through. And then also taking in lessons learned from other sort of industries. So we've got the rail industry, you would have CEMs, so engineering managers who are doing approvals. There is just always this thread of there are enough people who've got the knowledge and competency to assess the products. And what we're now suggesting through the Building Safety Act, that you go through a materials approvals process, that those on-scene changes do not happen, and that there is a much greater move to the left, and the contractor and the manufacturers, as Olga said, been involved a lot earlier. And if it's before Gateway 2, and potentially getting back to sometimes what we used to do in the past, you designed it and you built it and there weren't any changes as you went along. We used to do that. We seem to have moved away from that. Some of us are old enough to remember that. How do we get back to some of those processes? And I think that's that recalibration piece will help over this year.
Yeah, I think just on the unscrupulous substitute or cutting corners, whether it's unscrupulous substitutions or I think the wording is false and misleading claims by manufacturers. I think before people think about doing that, they maybe just want to Google Building Safety Act penalties because they're pretty substantial. And I think when Dame Judith Hackett was at our conference and she was presenting, she was saying that they really have teeth now. And another Google that's just worth doing is just looking up the penalties from the 2015 CDM, because there's a website that's got them all. And where jobs aren't done properly, and there's examples there, cutting through an underground cable, timber frame not having the right fire, structural safety and it's big fines that have been issued there, and in some cases prison sentences and suspended prison sentences. So
I was just going to actually say to Ben, actually, is it worth just, we've talked about the lovely, comfortable side of how we're going to improve and how we're going to change. But as you say, there are teeth behind this. There are penalties. There are the consequences to not doing what you are supposed to do. So Ben, in terms of those penalties, this could be jail, couldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in a short answer, yes, there are now very significant penalties for breach of building regs. I mean, and you see a kind of escalation. So where there's non-compliance with building regs or requirements in the Building Safety Act, the regulator's got the power to issue a stop notice. So effectively stop the non-compliant works until they're addressed. But in addition to those kind of compliance notices and stop notices, there are also unlimited fines and up to 1 year's imprisonment in magistrate court proceedings and up to 2 years in Crown Court proceedings. So effectively, contravention of the building regs has now been made a criminal offence. So yeah, super serious consequences if you don't comply.
It's also worth noting that the period during which those sanctions can be applied has been extended. So that there's now up to 10 years after a work has finished that sanction can still be imposed. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well. But as some form of comfort, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the way the regime has been set up with the series of notices, you have to go some way in your non-compliance to get to the point of facing a prosecution. You know, the intention is the system is set up to get it right the first time. The system has been set up to make sure there are the checks and balances in place, that we're doing the job properly. So it's only if you've received notices from the relevant building control authority and you've purposefully ignored those, or you've done something fraudulent or willful where you've given the wrong advice, or you've hidden something, or that's when you're going to face the prosecutions. So I think for generally most people on this call, if you're doing your job properly and you're doing it well and you're paying heed to the new procedural requirements, yes, those sanctions are there, but I don't think they need to be in the forefront of your mind.
Mm-hmm. We're getting an awful lot of questions through on domestic scale projects and the role of principal designers in whole sorts of different ways. Another area we haven't talked about, we've talked about record keeping, but we haven't talked about record handover at the end of the project, because obviously there is another stage, which is what the principal designer and the principal contractor have to certify and what they have to hand over. Adrian, do you want to just pick up on that one?
Yeah, I think, again, in many cases, we've to hand over exactly what we had to send in previously. So your health and safety file always should have had fire risk related information. Old money regulation 38, for as long as I can remember, always said you should have provided fire safety information in terms of operations, safe disposal, etc. Those have always been there. O&M manuals have always been there. And again, we're trying to be a lot more rigorous. And I've actually been on a number of calls over the last few days around how you approach that with 19650 hat on, and the client again being a lot more specific. This is the information that we need at the end of the project to hand over to the building safety manager if you're in a high risk project, or to the operator of whatever type of project. And again, aligning back to CIBSE and BISUA standards that have been there for a long, long time, and we've just lost sight of what that should contain. I think one of the things that would be really good for some of the industry bodies to produce, potentially REBA, is an approach to the health and safety file or the fire and construction file, etc., to give people a feel for what does that contain. But if you do go to the government websites, in terms, there's one around the submission for certification, it gives a flavour of what those things would be, but we know there's typically a lot more detail that sits in behind that. And again, that will be driven by the rigorousness of now you've got from Gateway 1 to Gateway 2 to Gateway 3, that the changes that you need to make should be minimal, and that your as-built or your construction record, depending on what terminology, are as accurate as we possibly can. And I think that's where that change comes in, that we are giving that much more accurate piece. And again, if I put my quality hat back on, our digital tools for quality and check sheets, which we've aligned to Uniclass, and Stephen and some of the team are aware of that we align, this is what the specification said, this is what the drawing says, this is actually how we built it out on site, and there's a correlation through. I think all the contractors were just all chipping away at making sure that that handover piece is a lot more accurate. And ideally, we then start to have consultants or lead designer or principal designers out supporting that inspection and test alongside the design managers and the site teams. So it becomes a lot more collaborative, depending on the scale of project as well.
I think the thing you say about templates, Adrian, I think really is a good point, because the one template that is out there that is the Planning Gateway 1 template that's on Gov UK, and it covers things like the access layout, overview of strategy for balconies, external envelope sprinklers, the fire service site plan. And I've looked on Glenigan, so the MBS sister company, the higher risk buildings all have one of these going through and it's all the same format as the government template. Like, is there room for more standardized templates out there?
I think from one of the tasks, our challenge is through the BS 8644 fiery, so-called fiery. That's going to go through a big review. And I was speaking to a number of people yesterday around how do we make that in a structure that can apply to all different scales of project. It's very much geared to mega high rise, but actually, what are the basics that you need to provide for a school, an extension, a house, etc. Well, how does that scale up and become a lot more applicable? And then how does REBA then support that in terms of architectural design? But then also we've got structural design, services design, all of those bodies all going, in theory, this is what we think you need to provide, and having a pretty good stab at industry lessons learned to feed into that.
Wonderful. Just picking up on what you've said, this is all well and good for buildings, high-risk buildings. Will contractors still apply this to our fictional 4-story building that isn't currently in scope?
Yeah, I think you do. I think there was a couple of articles recently that you have to treat every project in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter whether it's 30 stories or 1 story, the regulations scale up and down, and you do what is required for that type of project, from domestic to non-domestic, and all the way through to the mega projects, and it's proportionate to what you need to do. And in the skills and knowledge that you need for your practice will also be proportionate to what you need to do, and your PI will also be proportionate to the projects that you carry out. And as Dieter mentioned, the procedures that you've put in place within your practice, old money REBA handbook type stuff. How do you actually manage your practice, and how do you deal with those things in a sort of a more basic way that you've got the evidence all the way through?
Do you know, that's a great way, I think, to kind of finish that. It's not just about those high-risk buildings. This is going to apply to, well, it does apply to everything. And if it applies to everything, let's get those processes and procedures in place so that we all do the job we are supposed to do.
Yes.
I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who has joined. I'm really sorry we haven't got through all of your questions. This is such a huge subject. I mean, the number of people joining tells us it's such a huge subject. And it's one that will continue to develop. As time goes on, we'll learn more about how these processes work. Some of those things will change as we find the things that need to be adapted to give us a practical application. So we will keep doing this. We will keep informing and helping and engaging, as you all will, with the people that you work with in the industry. Just a reminder that come on to the MBS website, you will find all of those links. There will be this email tomorrow. You'll see more links. So those of you asking, tell us more about the design responsibility matrix, you'll find out where to go and have a look at that. All of those things you will see in an email tomorrow. So thank you for joining, and absolutely thank you to the panel. I've got to say, I found this really, really interesting. We could talk for hours. We could pick any one of these subjects and talk for hours about it. And maybe we need to. Maybe we need to pick off these individually and start getting into a little bit more detail. But on behalf of all the people watching, panel, thank you very much. Thank you to you watching, and I hope you found this a brilliant webinar. If you want to watch it all again, come onto the NBS website shortly. Thanks very much.